Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's Stowe Talks. Today we have another session on a very important topic that we've run many talks on around domestic abuse, but specifically tonight's Stowe Talks is on the topic of post-separation abuse and understanding and managing that. It's unfortunate that, abusive behaviours can often continue after a relationship has ended, and that abuse can take several forms and occur in lots of different scenarios. Tonight, we are extremely lucky to be joined by Lucy Wade. Lucy is a domestic abuse consultant. Lucy has created a website, You Don't Own Me, which focuses on this very difficult subject. And that, along with her podcast, which I'm sure Lucy will mention, is doing great work to break the stigma around domestic abuse and looking at the various complexities around that, along with providing resources and services to support those experiencing domestic abuse. These sessions are really important to us, and I hope you'll all engage and share any questions that you might have in the Q&A box as we go through Lucy's presentation. So Lucy, if I can pass over to you. Thank you so much.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to try and hopefully share my screen. This should be it now. Share. Can everybody see that? No? Yes? Can we see anything? Yeah, perfect. Hi, yes, so thank you very much for the introduction, Rachel. Yes, I'm Lucy. I do a lot of work around post-separation abuse. Obviously, it's a topic which many people, when I come across talking about it, will say, never heard of it. I thought once you left an abusive relationship, then that was it. This is where I step in and will say that's far from the truth. And it's unfortunately a marathon, not a sprint. It can go on for many, many years, especially if children are involved. And for me, it's so important that we talk about it because we highlight domestic abuse in so many workplaces now in conversations, but post-separation abuse still seems to be a topic that isn't understood. So what I've tried to do is put sessions together. So this is just a few slides from one of the sessions I do called Let's Talk Post-separation abuse. I also do one around communication, and domestic abuse is a kind of generic, giving people an understanding of what abuse is. So when we talk about what post-separation abuse is, when we think of, just as an example, if you are in a relationship and that relationship ends, when post-separation abuse is evident, the abuser cannot let go. They want to retain power and control, and they will do that by any means necessary. So if you're in a position where potentially you're going through divorce, that's a difficult enough situation for most people to handle at the best of times. Add into that post-separation abuse, and it does become very, very complex and very complicated. And I've just tried to highlight here some of the aspects of why it's important we talk about it. So when we think of post-separation abuse, we may think of maybe too many emails or too much this or too much that, but actually I've highlighted here restricting access to money and assets. So if this is something you're going through in terms of trying to work out when you might be selling the house, you might be working out what's happening in terms of whatever money is there in what's going to happen in the future and pensions and etc. Very often abusers will use money as a way of retaining that power and control. In terms of loans, very, very often I have seen with victims I've worked with when I worked in the charity sector myself, that victims have been coerced into taking out loans and debts in their own name. Therefore, it is essentially their debt, but coerced into doing this by the perpetrator. Homelessness, obviously, is something that comes up regularly. I've worked with people who have ended up living in accommodation, in refuge, with nowhere else to turn. And, you know, very often people will say, well, why didn't they just leave? You know, and when it comes to that point where maybe your only option is to be homeless, is to be in accommodation, that's a very, very scary place to be. And also, you know, when people ask that question, why didn't they just leave? For me, the answer should be, why would you assume somebody could? There are so many reasons why somebody doesn't leave an abusive relationship. And that's a whole other subject. Filing for divorce in itself can be very, very difficult. The perpetrator can make that very, very difficult to be filing papers, make it just drag it out as long as possible, make it really, really difficult. Mediation is another issue where very often a perpetrator will use mediation as a way of, again, retaining that control. And for the victim, this may be a point in time where they've just started to realise that what they've experienced is abuse and are only just starting to process it. So for them, when they're experiencing this and they're having to deal with mediation, the perpetrator knows exactly what they're doing, and the victim is now trying to almost catch up with what's been going on. And again, it's another area where they will use that power and control. Child maintenance arrangements, this is, for me, unfortunately, a classic I've seen many, many times. Evading paying child maintenance, finding all sorts of excuses as to the issues. And people will say, well, child maintenance is there, it's there to, you know, can it not be dealt with in X, Y, and Z ways? Actually, it is quite complicated, it is quite difficult. And also, all these things I'm talking about, you know, most people are also trying to balance looking after their families, working, potentially looking after family members on top of that in terms of older members of the family that maybe have two jobs. All these things are going on while that person is trying to live their life. And I think this is so important that we remember this. I always call it spinning 50,000 plates whilst trying to look to everybody like you're the perfect, you know, super mom, super dad. And it's so, so difficult. Family court proceedings, obviously, I'm sure, you know, in terms of Stowe, well aware when a perpetrator will use systems, and very much will use those systems, again, social services, police, etc. And they will use those systems against the victim and survivor, making many, many applications potentially to court, breaches of the order, for example, if, you know, the child doesn't answer the phone at a certain time, etc. These are all things to wear the victim down. And it's so important for me, I think, to make it clear that this is really the time when you start to notice all these things happening, you really need to reach out to support services. It has to be your choice. You can't be forced into it, obviously. But if you start to notice, you know, these are tick boxes that actually, yes, all these things are happening, there is absolutely nothing wrong with reaching out to a domestic abuse charity and asking for advice. They have plenty of people in place in terms of IDVAs, etc., and support there, and one-to-one counselling, group facilitation, maybe meet people who are experiencing something similar to you. It won't be the same because everybody's situation is unique. And then again, on top of all that, in terms of stalking and harassment, I did, on top of everything else I do a podcast, and I do that around all these different areas of domestic abuse. And one I did recently was about cyber stalking. So we always think of stalking and harassment as an in-person crime, but actually now stalking and harassment obviously has advanced to technology. And this is where it can make it very, very difficult for somebody to move on with their life if they're constantly being monitored by the perpetrator, and also being monitored through the children. You know, if children have, say, I can't think of an online game at the moment, my son's 18 now, but online gaming, you know, perpetrators may very well use that as a means of communicating and maybe coercing children. Emails and text messages, I will talk a bit about that actually. It's a very, very difficult area for many, many people, because you have to, unfortunately, communicate with the perpetrator. And when you're trying to communicate with the perpetrator, they will, if you say black, they'll say white. You know, it's very, very difficult when you're in that situation. And what I would say is, within those situations, it's really important to breathe and think before you send any kind of messages. I think it's important to take any kind of emotion out of it. I think what we find very often with victims and survivors is it's that emotion is in there, you know, our house, our children. I think it has to come to a point where you take that emotion away and say the children, the house, and almost deal with it as if it's a business transaction. I know that sounds like a horrible thing to say, because you're talking about your children, you're talking about somebody that potentially you've been with for a very long time. But taking that emotion away gives you a certain element of power and control back. And one thing I always say is type out whatever you want to say, but just don't send it. Reread, read over and over and over again, and make sure that you know that before you press that send button, because what a perpetrator wants is to get under your skin. They want you to react. They want you to look crazy. They want you to do all these things which will play right into their hands. And if you can stand back for a moment and say, okay, from now on, I'm going to deal with these emails by having a separate email account, and I'm going to have them there so I don't have to look at them 24/7. It's not constantly coming up in my face. I've known people who choose to have 2 different phones. It doesn't work for everybody, obviously. But some people choose to have different phones to give them that bit of respite, because otherwise, if the perpetrator thinks you're there looking at the phone 24/7, that's another way that they know they can keep that control. So it's trying to keep those kind of things within your power, within your control. And I think it's really important as well. Talking about triangulation is something that I don't know if it's one of those terms that not everybody knows about, and it may be something you have heard of, or you may not have heard of it. But triangulation is when a perpetrator will bring into the relationship or the post-relationship a member of the family or a friend or somebody where they can use that control to carry on the manipulation. So then the family member or friend might say, but they're lovely, they're trying so hard, they're a great dad, they're a great mom. And the sad fact of it is that the perpetrator is using somebody else to carry on that manipulation. If they don't think they're getting away with it and it's happening with you directly, they will use other people quite happily to bring into that situation. And in terms of terminology, when I talk about different terminologies, love bombing in particular is one. We hear all these terminologies, don't we? We hear all these things that are used and banded around in society: gaslighting, coercive control, and people are kind of going, well, I don't think that's happened to me. And very often you don't think it has happened to you until it gets to a point where you sort of almost are out of the fog, if you like. And usually post-separation is the time where you start to realize, actually, that wasn't normal. What I was experiencing wasn't a normal relationship. The risk I was at and the pressure that was on me all the time, that wasn't normal. That isn't a normal, healthy relationship. And so with love bombing, and unfortunately, when it comes to post-separation abuse, the perpetrator is relying on you going back to that point where there is a relationship there. There has been, and it is very difficult to draw that distinction and that line, and nobody's saying it's easy. But I think if we can learn more and understand more, and if organizations, everybody has jobs and everybody's trying to balance their lives, if organizations understood a bit more about the terminology, they then could support their staff and employees. So when we talk about things like love bombing, trauma bonding, again, post-separation, trauma bonding is something that a perpetrator will rely on. They rely on the fact that you're in this cycle with them where every time in that relationship, they've apologized after something has happened and everything's okay for a little while. And then again, it slowly gets worse and worse. You're always hoping that you're going to get back to that point where you're happy or thought you were happy, and so you are completely trauma bonded to them. And it's the same with post-separation abuse. Deep down, a victim or survivor will hope that the perpetrator, that at some point they can come to some understanding, not necessarily, obviously don't want to be together, but that the perpetrator will understand. And sadly, victims and survivors are very empathetic and they want to believe the best in people. We all want to believe the best in people. Unfortunately, a perpetrator chooses to abuse. And unfortunately, a perpetrator, really all they want is the power and control. So no matter what you try and do, you have to keep that in the back of your mind, that it's giving it oxygen all the time. In terms of gaslighting, this was another one I talked about recently, where it originally comes from a film in the 1930s. And again, it's a word that's used a lot. But when we think of gaslighting, when we think of abuse, many times people will say, well, I assumed it was physical. It isn't always physical. And as I'm sure many people know, it's the financial, it's the emotional, it's the psychological, it's the sexual. There's so many other areas that abuse covers. And that doesn't change through post-separation abuse, because obviously they are still trying to psychologically control you. And when we look at gaslighting, and when we look at the fact that I've worked with people who have, and I'm 46, who in their late 30s, and I've just done a session for Alzheimer's Society on this, have believed that they were struggling with the early onset of dementia. That is how much a perpetrator has made them believe that they are losing their minds, that their reality is not reality, that, you know, when a perpetrator will say, don't you remember I told you this? Don't you remember we agreed this? And they get to the point where they genuinely, that victims and survivors genuinely believe that they are losing their minds and that they need to go and see the doctor and they need to go and get a prescription for something or go and be checked out, because again, they're putting that blame and shame on themselves when actually it is the perpetrator. Child to parent abuse, this is something that sadly is prevalent and is something that doesn't again get talked about very often, and it is very much linked with post-separation abuse. Where do you draw the line where your child is pushing the boundaries and where they're actually being abusive? And this is a really tough one for a lot of parents to deal with, because unfortunately through post-separation abuse, what a victim, survivor, parent will do their utmost to make sure that their children are happy, that they're settled, that they're cared for. They will 100% put the child at the centre of everything they do. A perpetrator will not. And unfortunately, sometimes we do find that children do display abusive behaviours. Now, that may be because they've grown up in that situation and they lived in that environment. And there are lots of places out there. There's an organisation called PEGS. I can always send all the links over to this, but PEGS is a fantastic organisation that works with parents who, again, you know, how devastating for a parent who's already experienced abuse themselves now have to try and manage a situation where their child is being abusive. And very much around this, we find that parents overcompensate. They want to, you know, maybe give a lot to their children materialistically. I've just done a post about this on LinkedIn today. You know, it's so awful for victim and survivor parents because they just want to give them the best Christmas, the best birthday, and they may not be able to afford to do that. So they overcompensate and maybe spend far too much on the credit card to give the children everything they want. And usually what will happen is a perpetrator parent will try and match this then, or go one step further and say, well, I'm going to provide this and I'm going to provide that, and I can afford much more than you can. I think it's so important, again, at this point in time, if you start to recognise those signs, that you do reach out for help. And 100% it is okay to be afraid. It's okay to think I'm embarrassed. It's okay to think I feel ashamed that I've let it get to this. There's no harm in feeling all those things, but it's not your fault. It's at 100% is not your fault. These are things that have happened because of the fact you've been abused. And I think it's so important that when you do reach out for support, you do start to realise, actually, I've done nothing wrong. So I don't need to feel shame. I don't need to feel blame. And I 100% am doing the right thing by getting that support and that help that's out there. So, sorry, I'm just flicking through my notes. When we look at, one of the things I wanted to talk about is helping in terms of family and friends, because I think with family and friends, they really can struggle to know how to support a family member who is experiencing post-separation abuse. And one of the issues is that they don't want to say the wrong thing. They're really scared that they are going to 100% put their foot in the mouth and say something, i.e. along the lines of, well, why didn't you leave sooner? Or I could have told you years ago they were like this, or blah, blah, blah. And it can be really scary for family and friends because they don't want to alienate that person anymore, that person that they care about. I think, you know, I did an episode a while ago with a psychotherapist called Sari Taylor, and we talked about the impact on friendships. And she talked about a situation she'd been in many years ago where she spoke out, but now realizes that maybe she should have listened a bit more. The problem is when we speak out and when we actually say things to our family and friends that we are maybe concerned are in an abusive relationship, unfortunately, sometimes it can actually push the perpetrator and victim closer together, because what the perpetrator has done is create this world where it's just the two of them, and they've made the victim survivor want to kind of lean in on the perpetrator even more, so they don't need the family and friends. So then come post-separation abuse, a family and friend who maybe wants to say something and feels guilty that they didn't say anything, is at a point in their life where they're not sure what to do. And this is where I would say it's, again, 100% acceptable for a family or family member or friend to contact a domestic abuse charity in their area, ask for support. I've been asked this many, many times. Well, I thought it was just for victims and survivors. A charity is not going to turn around and say, we're not going to give you advice. They will 100% give you any advice you need around talking about, if you are concerned, if you do think that somebody is really struggling post-separation abuse and maybe hasn't reached out for support themselves, you can then find ways as to how you can help them. The biggest thing I would say is listening, 100%. I think once you build that trust up, once you make sure that the person that you care about knows that you are not judging them, because unfortunately society judges victims and survivors. The blame and shame is, and we've seen that recently in the news in France, it's always the blame and shame is with the victim, whereas actually the blame and shame should be with the perpetrator. And we need to change that narrative that actually, if you are somebody who has experienced abuse, you are not to feel any kind of guilt about it, and you are to go and get the help and support you need when you need it and when you think is the right time for you. So for family and friends, I would say it's a case of being patient, of just being there. And that sounds really kind of trite and, things we say all the time, but it really is so true, and it makes all the difference. I've worked with people who have said, they just came around and had a cup of tea. We didn't even talk about it, but then I ended up saying something about da-da-da. It's just showing up for people, and it's letting them know that you're not judging them. And again, within organisations, when I did the session for Alzheimer's Society, one of the questions I was asked was, what can victims and survivors do to protect themselves? And again, what I came back with was, it's for us as society, it's for organisations to understand abuse better, so that they know, so that victims and survivors know that they can reach out. At this point in time, many, many people will work a working day, month, year, whatever. They could be taking days holiday to go to family court. They could be taking days holiday, all these different things to go and speak to a solicitor. If you can get to that point where you feel comfortable to speak to your organisation and say, look, I am experiencing this, then hopefully they should be able to help. And this is where we need to change that narrative again around it being something that, as an organisation, make it clear that you are there for that person, make it clear that you are an understanding organisation that doesn't look down on domestic abuse as being something that's over there that only affects a certain demographic, because it affects everybody in one way or another. We all know somebody who either we are suspecting is in an abusive relationship, has come out of an abusive relationship, we've worked with somebody, with family. Again, it touches all of us in one way or another. So I think it's really important that we change that narrative and make it clear that we're not blaming the victim, and actually it's down to us to change our mindset and our language and how we talk about abuse, and how we listen more and how we take in, because victims and survivors have some amazing ideas and amazing suggestions, and because it's their experience, they know it better than anybody, and we just need to listen a bit more. I was just going to go on to this now. So in terms of, sorry, can we see the next one now? Can we see that? Yeah. So another thing I talk a lot about is, if somebody says to me, well, okay, but I'm not ready to look for support, or I have looked for support and it wasn't the right thing for me, or it didn't work for me, or, I tried one-to-one counselling, but no, or I tried 6 months ago and I've come back again and it still doesn't work. What I would say is it is 100% around timing. Timing is everything. You might find 2 years down the line, you are in a situation where you think, now I'm ready. There is no expiration date. There is no limit to when you will feel ready to access support. It doesn't have to be the second you've left. It doesn't have to be the second, the children are 18 and you think now's the time I should look after myself and go and get support. It has to be when you're ready. But in the meantime, I think what's so important is to look at well-being and self-care, because it's that age all around putting the oxygen mask on yourself before you try putting it on anybody else. And that is so true, because when you are experiencing post-separation abuse and you do have those 50,000 plates spinning, you are running on adrenaline most of the time. You're not sleeping, you're worrying 24/7, you're scared, You're dealing with God knows how many emails, text messages, etc., etc. You've got people coming at you from agencies, coming at you from all angles. And it gets to a point where burnout is inevitable. And so many victims and survivors are petrified of this because they think, now this makes me look like I'm an unfit parent and I can't do everything, and it's all my fault, and then spiral and spiral and spiral. So one thing I try and do when I work with organisations now, and when I talk to victims and survivors, is around that really important element of self-care. So yes, it's lovely to have your bubble baths and everything else, and that is 100% important, brilliant, good, and you should be doing it, and you should be taking that time for yourself. But sometimes it goes a bit deeper. And one thing I did when I worked for the charity I worked for was this circle of control. Now, this was with children, but it also works with adults as well. I've known people who quite happily have it printed off on their walls as a visual constantly for them. And the idea of the circle of control is to really visualize what is out of your control and what is within your control. So examples obviously is how a perpetrator speaks to you, whether it's by text message, whether it's over the phone, whether it's via email, whatever it is, whether it's on social media. You can't control how they speak to you. What you can control, though, is how you react to it. So by not reacting, by not, no reaction is the best reaction, as they say. And it takes a lot to be able to do that. And I understand it's not that straightforward and it's not that easy. But when people do get to that point where they can work out what is within their control, it does start to change. And I've seen a shift in people when they've accepted that, okay, I can't change who the perpetrator is. I can't change how they choose to behave. Those are all things that are on them. You can't keep taking that and bringing it all on yourself, because again, the burnout is inevitable. But if you can make those decisions and think, okay, now I'm going to put my boundaries in place. And we hear a lot about boundaries. This is another word we talk a lot about as well. But again, it's something that is used around children and young people work that I've done. And we talk about boundaries, and actually children are pretty smart, and they know what their boundaries are. They know, that, well, how somebody spoke to me, that's not acceptable. To call me, a stupid fat pig or whatever. We also know that happens with perpetrators in adult relationships. Very much the verbal abuse is a huge part of not only domestic abuse, but post-separation abuse. And, this all comes out in the text messages, in the emails. Well, I said you were stupid, or whatever it would be. So you can decide to not let that in and say, okay, how they're going to choose to speak to me, there's nothing I can do about that. So when we start to visualize that and say, okay, that's out of my control, there is a certain sense of freedom in that, I think, for many, many people. And also, it does take that oxygen away from the perpetrator, because they're not getting what they want. They're not getting that fix that they need, basically, of getting that reaction from you. And something else I was asked recently in a session I did was around just thinking of all these things around control and what's within your control. Was, does drugs and alcohol cause someone to be abusive? Does this X, Y, and Z, does it cause them to be abusive? And my response was, drugs and alcohol will always exacerbate a situation, 100%. And I think I talked about this recently in the podcast episode. And again, I've talked about it in other sessions, and it does come up quite regularly, because what happens is, when you've left a situation, maybe you think to yourself, well, they were only like that because, well, it was because, they'd had a drink, or it was because they'd taken drugs. An abuser chooses to abuse, and that's the bottom line. It doesn't matter whether alcohol or drugs are involved. They are choosing to be abusive. Yes, those things will exacerbate a situation 100%. But it isn't the reason someone's abusive. That's their choice. So when you realize that, when you accept that, I think it's easier to do things like this and look at a circle of control and say, okay, well, that's out of my control. How they choose to behave is nothing I can deal with. And as long as you are, when you put your head on the pillow at night, you've done the best you can possibly do, then that's when I think you've hit a point post-separation where no matter what happens, no matter what is thrown at you, you are doing the right thing and you are doing the best you can. And children do see that. If children are part of the post-separation abuse, children are very savvy. They do see which parents are showing up for the right reasons and putting their needs first. They do see that 100%. It may take time. It may be a very long time, and it may take the child, obviously getting to a point where they think, well, I'm not sure what I want here, but they will eventually see through it, and they do see through it. And another thing that I think is very difficult for people to accept, and again, I've talked about this with victims and survivors, is what we have to remember is a child, when we're talking about children love both parents. At the end of the day, they will love both parents, regardless of whether they're the perpetrator or the victim survivor parent. Children just want to be loved. So of course it's their parents, they love them. And I think one thing that's really important, especially when working with children, is to say, that's fine, that's, of course you love them, but you don't have to accept or like the behaviour that they're displaying, because obviously if they're displaying abusive behaviours, post-separation abuse, whether it's verbally, whether it's psychologically to the children, that's not acceptable. And it's okay for the children to know it's not acceptable to be spoken to like that. Otherwise, we're creating a situation where children think, again, we're perpetuating the problem where they think it's acceptable to be treated in that way. And obviously it isn't. Let me have a look now. What was I going to talk about next? Trying to remember. Where was I at? I'm not sure if I think I may have almost covered everything. I talked that much and that fast. Helping a friend, tips. Yeah, I think when it comes to finding that help and support, and again, I'll just go on to the next slide. I've said, I guess I get asked a lot about how victims and survivors can help themselves spot the signs of abuse. And obviously, again, I've said here, instead of asking what the individual can do, we should be asking what we can do to support victims and survivors. So if you're in a work environment and you think to yourself that you have an idea that could potentially help your organisation to understand things a bit better, don't be ashamed or afraid of asking or going and saying, I'd like to talk about this. When I did the session for Alzheimer's Society recently, 200 people attended, and at the end of the session, they'd had a lived experience network within the society, and it basically fizzled out. By the end of the session, 11 people came forward and said, we'd like to revive this group, and we feel now that we've got, you know, the tools to be able to go and sit and have that conversation and support each other. And that was huge. That, you know, that's the reason I do what I do, because it is about that support. It's about that peer support. It's about knowing that people understand, and not necessarily understand as in, you know, it's not identical. Every situation is going to be unique. And I've had people who've said to me, well, you don't understand because it's this and this. Of course it is, because it's your situation and only you know about it. And you can't compare. You might be able to say, well, there's threads there that are very similar. And unfortunately, with perpetrators and with abusers, there is very much a blueprint. And when we think of things like, for example, especially post-separation abuse, there may be, you know, you're doing the handing over at the weekends, and you're the one packing the clothes for the children. It's the kind of classic sign. You do the right thing, pack the clothes, give the clothes over, and the perpetrator isn't doing anything to be involved or help. They just take it and then they send it back, or they don't send things back purposely to keep hold of it. It's all these mind games to get you to react and to get, you know, stressed about it. And really, if we can get back to that circle of control, we say, well, I can't control, it's just clothes. I know it's wrong and I know it's not fair and I know they've taken so much from you already, but it is just some clothes at the end of the day. And they will do all these little things that are very much the blueprint of abuse to try and really keep getting that reaction from you, because that is what they're craving. You do see it, actually. You see it very clearly. Once somebody starts to withdraw and not engage as much, not only does the victim survivor start to feel, not immediately, it's not going to be, you know, problem solved, but they start to feel like they're getting a sense of control back. Not only that, the perpetrator tries even harder, and it almost heightens it and escalates things, because they're not getting what they want. But, you know, stay the course, stand your ground, don't react, because that unfortunately is precisely what they want. I think I've talked now for about half an hour, so I'm not sure if you want to have some questions or anything like that for a little while before I keep talking forevermore.
Thank you, Lucy. It was really, really helpful presentation, and certainly there's some questions that have come through. Whilst you've just been talking about the circle of control diagram, there's a question around how you can ignore the perpetrator's behaviour when that impacts on your child. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that you could share.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I would say is, if you are concerned that this is having an impact on the children, domestic abuse support services are not just there for adult victims and survivors, they're there for children. And I have seen with my own eyes, when a child is, what would happen is the child would, you would do a referral. And believe me, if you're putting things in there that tick all the boxes and they will be referred in for support. What will happen is they will have group facilitation, which they'll be with, and if they don't want to talk, they don't have to talk, but it's children of a similar age where they can sit, and maybe a child might say something that makes that child think, oh, hang on a minute, I can relate to that. But not only that, if they are then identified as needing one-to-one support, you as the parent will be supported throughout that. You know, obviously they will let you know all the stages of what will need to happen in terms of that support, whether it's going into school and doing some intervention work in school. There's absolutely no issue with talking to school, you know, quietly, confidentially, and saying, I have this concern about my child. You know, many schools, any school I've known does have that support in place where you can go in and have that conversation and say, I'm worried about my child. You know, you do find sometimes that teachers will spot it for themselves, and they may pull a parent to one time saying, I'm a bit worried about X, Y, and Z because, you know, they're a bit quiet in class, or they're a bit this, or they're a bit that. And again, it can feel really embarrassing for a parent to have to say it out loud that this is what's happening. But obviously it is all completely confidential. And it is, you know, schools are there to offer that support. And again, if you do want to speak to your local domestic abuse charity and say, I am worried about my child, you will receive a referral, and then you can go through that process, and they will do all these kind of things with the children to give them that emotional intelligence to understand what's happening to them. Because I think once they know themselves and have that boundary in place, that they know how, you know, it may be that they're having to go to that parent, but maybe if they've had that support, they have the mechanisms in place for themselves to know how to manage it when they're around that situation.
So we've got another question around boundaries and how to set boundaries with your ex-partner if they're always threatening to take you to court.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the you know, some advice around that are things that you've already mentioned around kind of communication, but you know, have you got any other tips on kind of managing that kind of scenario where there's always constant threats?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, especially when it comes to family court, because I think, you know, anyone that's experienced family court knows it's a very, very, very difficult situation, and you need a lot of support to get through the family court process, especially if you're dealing with, you know, the applicant being a perpetrator. I would say, obviously, depending on whether there's a court order in place, etc. If you're doing the right thing and you're, you know, you're sticking to whatever it is that's set out in that order. If the perpetrator is swapping and changing things within, usually it's within their own order that they've insisted upon. It's really difficult, but sticking to your guns and saying, okay, you know, with all the threats, unfortunately, they will either threaten and not go ahead with it, or they're going to threaten and they're going to go ahead with it. And you have to be prepared for either. I think you have to have that preparation in your head, and it's horrible because it's, you know, the anxiety builds, and this is where it's important to have that care in place and that support in place. If they are threatening to repeatedly go back, that is clearly a sign of post-separation abuse. And that to me is where you would go and get that support, and you would go and ask for support, because then as well, that is evidence, that is written down that you have gone for support because you are constantly being threatened with court proceedings. So I would say definitely have a think about it, but maybe think about contacting your local charity. Even, you know, ring domestic abuse helpline. They can point you in the direction of lots of different organisations that you can speak to. But I would say, you know, get that kind of evidence in place that you're making it clear that these are threats that you're dealing with all the time. If you are very concerned, that would be, and you are being threatened, you know, regularly, that would be the thing I would suggest is get that support and get that evidence down that you are having support, and potentially for your children as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, making sure it's, you know, you're able to evidence that you've been to take that support. And there's quite a few other questions around that as well. in terms of other support beyond kind of school. I think speaking to your GP about your concerns, they can often signpost as well. That's really important as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, sometimes people haven't had the best experience with GPs because they felt that maybe the first port of call is to say, we'll put you on antidepressants, which then unfortunately almost plays into the perpetrator's hands, because then they will say, well, they're on antidepressants, so clearly they're crazy. But actually now within the GP surgery, you can ask for or to be referred to a social prescriber. So a social prescriber is there and they will be able to signpost you to relevant organisations as well, or maybe set you up with support groups that you can attend. These are all the things really, again, is getting that evidence there. And we keep coming back to the same thing. If agencies were educated and understood abuse and understood the red flags, as people call them, then they would realise that these are all the classic signs of abuse, the constant threats of returning to court, throughout, the children's lives. But I would say definitely, if you are concerned and you go to your GP, you can ask to be put on the referral list for a social prescriber. And again, this is all evidence. This is all written down. It's all there for you. If you don't feel like you're getting somewhere with school, contact your local council. 100% contact the council and say, I don't feel like I'm getting the support from my school around X, Y, and Z with my child. Take it to another level if you need to.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There is lots of support out there. It's just making sure you're signposted to it and getting the support that you need. There's quite a few questions in the Q&A around how the courts look at things, and whether they understand perpetrators' behaviour or not, and the kinds of abuse that they look at. I think what I would say from the legal side of things is that it's certainly an area where we're seeing kind of lots of development and changes at the moment. So there's now guidance in place around cross-examination in court, so that you're not cross-examined by your perpetrator in court, and that you don't have to cross-examine them, for example, if you're not legally represented. So there's definitely developments there, and certainly changes with CAFCAS, in terms of a new pilot. Well, it's not so new now, but the Pathfinder pilot, which has been rolled out nationally, and that's really there to focus on the voice of the children, and to ensure that any trauma and domestic abuse that victim or the children have experienced is kind of minimised as they go through the court process. And they've had some more guidance recently around a domestic abuse policy and how they deal with domestic abuse in their work. So it's certainly it's a developing an increasing kind of area within the courts and CAFCAS, which I think's is a really welcome change within our work.
Yeah.
Just having a look at some of the other questions that have come in. So there's one here around what if a former partner ignores the proposals of early help and any shared care childcare rota, and makes holiday plans that defy previous agreements and denies you access to the children's passports. I mean, it's certainly something that you should take legal advice on. But if you've tried all other routes to try and resolve matters, then you have got recourse to the court, to the family court, to obtain a specific issue order for the passports to be released to you. And if you're experiencing those kind of difficulties with the arrangements that you've agreed, then it may be that you do need something more formal in terms of a child arrangements order setting out those arrangements, so that you've got something in the future that's solid, let's say, to rely on in terms of any future breaches to the arrangements that you've reached. Lucy, I don't know if there's some more of these you would like to answer. So another one, what can a lawyer do to help me in separation? I think it's really important that you take early legal advice when you're when you're separating or you're considering a separation. A lawyer can assist you with all types of difficulties you might experience in terms of arranging the arrangements for your children, looking at the finances and what a financial settlement might look like if you're married, or what your entitlement might be if you're cohabiting, so you're not married, and also assisting with the divorce process. Again, if you're married, they're all things that we can help you with. And it's really important that we work together with other professionals like Lucy, divorce coaches, IFAs, other professionals, to make sure that you've kind of got all the support and the different kinds of support alongside the legal support that you need to get you through and out the other side to move on. I think you'd agree with that, wouldn't you, Lucy?
Absolutely. And I was just going to say, from previous experience of working with people, if maybe you're feeling a bit nervous about going to see a solicitor and you don't want your partner knowing, you can maybe take a friend with you that you trust to have that conversation, so that they may be able to think of things that you can't think of off the top of your head because you're worrying or you're panicking and you can't remember everything. You think you've written everything down, and they may be able to remember something. And if it is somebody that you trust and that will be able to come in and have that conversation, they may be able to add different layers to it that you might have forgotten about. And I mean, I'm obviously no lawyer, but again, it's having that support, isn't it, when you're having those difficult conversations. And the perpetrator doesn't need to know that you've gone. That's another aspect. They don't need to know that you've gone for support. They don't need to know that you've gone and asked for help. I did have a case where the victim was worried that the perpetrator had found out they'd gone to speak to a domestic abuse charity. Long story short, they were convinced, and it was trying to let that person know no domestic abuse charity is going to go and say, well, if somebody rings up saying, my ex-wife or my ex-husband has come to you for support, they're going to say, oh yeah, of course they have. That's not going to happen. And again, this is a perpetrator trying to coerce and gaslight. And this is why it is important to have that support when you go ask, go, and the big things to talk about finances, about the children. And it may be as somebody that if you're already involved with the court process, maybe it might be your Mackenzie friend. If you can't, if you're in a situation where you can't afford a solicitor or that legal support, then maybe it's somebody that can go with you and have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've touched on communication quite a lot tonight in terms of how you communicate with your ex-partner. And there's a question here around parenting apps, which are something that I absolutely promote for lots of my clients. And the question here is really around the ex-partner not agreeing to use the co-parenting app. I think and the question is there any way of forcing this? Certainly, you can't force the ex-partner to use it, but the court, if you are within family court proceedings, it's certainly something that can be incorporated into a child arrangements order if you do find yourself in proceedings. But if it's not something that they will agree to, then certainly I would endorse what Lucy says around separate email accounts, and only looking at that at certain times to try and manage the difficulties that come with receiving numerous emails about various things. It's just finding a way really that you can communicate when you need to for the children, and finding a way that's best for you essentially. But it's the court are very, very alive to parenting apps now, will order the use of them if they need to.
Yeah, and just on that, you just made me think then when you were saying about that, because obviously one of the reasons a perpetrator doesn't want to use a parenting app is because they can't then manipulate the messages, they can't edit them, whereas just using WhatsApp alone, they can edit them, they can manipulate that. So obviously parenting apps are a great way, as you say, of being able to protect yourself. Another thing to maybe think about as well is the use of FaceTime. You know, if you're post-separation abuse and a perpetrator is insisting on FaceTime within the family home, you know, within the house that you're now in or wherever you're living, that's something to think about, because obviously that's your space now, that's your, you know, peace and quiet and your privacy. And it's just to be conscious, especially with children when they're walking around holding the phone and they're on FaceTime, etc. It's things like that just to be mindful of. I have had situations where a child has had a phone given to them by the perpetrator parent. I'm not saying go rooting through your children's bedrooms, but again, these are the levels that a perpetrator will go to. And maybe this is an agreement that the parents have had, and they've said, look, we won't give them a phone until, I don't know, year 6, year 7. But actually the perpetrator has gone ahead and given it to them a lot earlier, and then kind of coerced and saying, oh, it's a really good idea because we can chat and we can communicate, and just don't let, you know, mum or dad know that we've done this, etc. So it's just being mindful of all these other things that could be going on, and just to be conscious of the fact that, you know, obviously a perpetrator will use lots of different methods.
Yeah. And kind of another point around the parenting apps, and it kind of goes to one of the other questions around you know, communicating and evidencing to the family court things that are going on. With lots of the parenting apps, you can download all of the messages, so they can be exhibited to any statements that you might need to file with the court. And it is that point around, you know, once they're sent, they can't be edited or deleted. So it has got that advantage, as you say. So Lucy, how about some communication or some tips on communication if a perpetrator is sending lots of messages or is trying to contact you in lots of different ways, essentially? Any tips around dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's enough to say to a perpetrator, you know, this constitutes as harassment, and I will contact the police, you know, I will. And as much as people think that the police don't take it seriously, if you are able to evidence it and say, you know, there's situations where they constantly are sending messages and it's getting to the point where it does feel like harassment, and you can explain that to the police, they will look at that. So what they do is initially it will be considered as a force-wide incident number. And then from that point, when you have that conversation with an officer, they will then say, and it's not always like face-to-face, it's probably over the phone, and you can explain the situation, and then it can potentially be created as a crime reference number. And again, that's more evidence. You know, it's awful that we have to think in these terms, but if somebody is constantly bombarding you, it may be that they're sending things to the house for the children all the time and saying, but it's for the children, it's not for you. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's unwanted gifts and communication, and that is unfortunately harassment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, there were some questions earlier on around kind of prosecution of you know, some types of this behavior. Certainly, you know, if you are experiencing harassment, you know, do log it with the police. You know, and it really depends on the type of behavior as to which court will deal with, you know, and when the court will deal with it. But certainly, you know, coercive control is a criminal offence now. So, you know, if you've got concerns, do report them to the police, and that, you know, that can be progressed if it meets the threshold. And you know, we have got non-molestation orders, occupation orders, which are, you know, we can obtain through the family court to protect against these types of behaviours. So you know, there are protections out there for you. So it's important to remember that. Yeah, so the questions around evidencing things to the family court. I think things we've already mentioned around communications, being able to evidence those, but also it's about being able to show to the court in lots of these scenarios kind of the pattern of behaviour and how that's gone on over time. So they're kind of things that you'll be able to evidence again in any statements that you need to file with the family court. And it's certainly something, again, you should take legal advice on the best way to portray and evidence what's going on to the court. Just on the other side of things, the opposite to too much communication, we've got a question around no communication at all. I have the opposite problem regarding communication. I've had silent treatment for years in my marriage, refusing to engage in any conversations, and this is extended into post-separation. Won't respond to anything regarding the children, holidays, etc. How do you manage this? I mean, certainly from a legal side of things, and Lucy may have some other views around it. Ultimately, if they're not engaging in resolving matters arising from the breakdown of your marriage, I would take some legal advice on it, because your ultimate recourse, if you need assistance in resolving matters, is with the family court. To kind of move things in that direction, to get you clear orders about what's meant to happen when with the children, for example. I don't know if you have any other kind of insight into that, Lucy.
Yeah, I think obviously, from the legal aspect, you've covered that. And it is something that does happen in terms of that. The exact opposite is no communication. And again, that's a form of punishment. By not communicating, they're making it even more difficult. And it goes back to what I said before about the parent that is putting the children at the centre of everything becomes a parent, and the parent that isn't putting the children at the centre of everything also becomes a parent, as obviously the perpetrator. And I think for me personally, the centre of all that is the children and the effect it will be having on them and the impact it will be having on them, because, many children who experience not only, divorce, but also post-separation abuses, they blame themselves. They think it's their fault. They think if they'd have been better, maybe this wouldn't have happened, or they could be loved more, etc. And again, I think that goes back to getting the support for the children, because this is something that will impact them. And obviously, as they become older, some children are quite happy to talk to their parent and say, look, this is how I feel about the situation. Some aren't, because they feel like they're betrayed, even though the other parent doesn't want to know, and they feel like they're betraying that parent. So I think it's really important to get that support for the children, so that they have an outlet themselves where they can then express how they're feeling about it, because they may not be able to say it to the parent that's also having to deal with all this at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're approaching the 6:30 mark now. So I'm going to bring today's Stowe Talks to a close. Just a massive thank you to Lucy for joining us this evening, and for sharing your really helpful insight into post-separation abuse. Please do reach out to Lucy and to her really helpful website for any support that you may need. And as you will have seen in the chat, the recording of tonight's Stowe Talks will be shared in the next few days. We're really thankful for you all joining us tonight, and we will share details of the next Stowe Talk soon. So hope you all take care and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.